Hey y'all! I want to talk today about audio feedback loops, especially digital feedback loops, focusing on the different processes we can apply to audio in these loops, and especially thinking about timbre. Let me start by proposing a continuum of spectral complexity. So on one end of the spectrum, we could have silence. Silence contains no frequencies, so perhaps that's the most spectrally simple thing we can have. On the other end of the spectrum, we can have noise, which is all the frequencies, more or less. I'd make an argument that silence on its own conveys no information, and noise alone conveys no information. Now, you could alternate between silence and noise and make a rhythm and things like that, but just pure silence on its own and pure noise on its own aren't really conveying anything musically or expressively. It's worth emphasizing here that when I say noise, I'm not talking about noise music, which tends to be very dynamic and have change over time, despite the fact that it tends to have a greater spectral complexity than for example, Mozart or tonal music. If you're with me so far, I would say that the next least complex spectrum after silence is a sine wave. As I've mentioned before, a sine wave consists of only a single frequency. So then we can say that, okay, if silence is the least complex thing, the next step over is going to be to add a single frequency. It's hard to do that in the other direction from noise because once you have multiple things happening at the same time, you have to talk about the relationship of those frequencies in amplitude, etc. Once again, just to acknowledge, I'm not talking here about amplitude, I'm just talking about spectral complexity along this continuum. So a lot of the processes that we apply to audio and synthesis are concerned with pushing things along this continuum one way or the other. So, for example, a filter. A filter takes something like a saw wave, which has some spectral complexity, and it's removing frequencies. When filters have resonance, it kind of complicates which way we're moving it down this line. But for the flip side, you could take a sine wave and we apply FM synthesis to it or wave folding. Then we're adding more harmonics, and so we're moving it the other direction down this continuum of spectral complexity. Now, I'm not proposing this as some great theory to approach all music with, and of course, the clever among you are already drafting your comments to rebut my statement on this, but let's take this as a framework for thinking about the feedback loops that I want to explore today. I want to make feedback loops that are dynamic, that change over time, and maybe even self-regulating to a certain extent. If I just have something that continues to add more and more spectral complexity to a sound, eventually I'm going to end up at noise. And if I have something in my process that continues to filter out sounds, I'm either going to end up with a sine wave or a few sine waves or silence. So if I can make a feedback loop that does both, maybe I can make this self-regulating system that's going to be more interesting over time. So I have something that adds spectral components to the sound as it goes through this loop, and one that removes spectral components as we go through the loop. And then we have them fight it out and see what happens. Well, not see what happens, hear what happens. Today, I'm going to be working in Kyma, but once again, as always, we're interested in the concepts here, not the software. I will say that different softwares can yield very, very different results in these feedback loops, depending on how their DSP works. So I've done something similar in Pure Data, I've done something similar in Reactor, and my sonic results have been pretty diverse. Okay, so let's start here with our sine wave. Command B, oscillator. Let's grab this friend. Okay, if we play this, there should be few surprises. Okay, all makes sense. I did Command K there to stop it. Envelope, gates, that'll give us a button called gates. And let's go smooth. And then frequency, let's just set this to be 60 note number. Okay, so I push a button and that gate's gonna go all the way to 1. This should be significantly louder than it just was, but here we go. Here's my button. Right, and the smooth in this is just making it so it doesn't pop. I don't have any selection over the frequency there. It's just always gonna be at middle C, note number 60. Okay, so now let's check out a delay. I'm going to use a delay with feedback. It's delay with feedback variable. Okay, let's just bring this in, dump it on the wire. Bank. Important to note that my dry is not in here right now, so I'll undo this in just a second. Let's throw in a mixer. Bank. Go into our mixer, drop in our oscillator, and so now we have both the oscillator and the delay with feedback. Okay, let's hit a button. I mean, specifically this gate button. Okay, so this already has feedback built into this sound object here. Let me crank this feedback. Now with a feedback of 1, this should just continue to go forever. I can change the delay time here. Changing that while something's in the buffer, it changes the pitch too, as you heard. Okay, Command K. All right, so this is all great. I got those controls there. Let's set this feedback to 0 here, though. And now, instead, let's do this a different way. Instead of delay with feedback, let's use a feedback loop input. So we're going to take what comes out of this feedback. So I'm going to need this output in just a second. Just to clarify, keep in mind, right? Usually you think the input is on this side, right? And the output's on this side, but this is what you're sending into the feedback loop. And then we're going to get it back out of there. Taking that dry signal out of the mix. Mixer. So we're going to take that original oscillator, which is really just going to be our trigger for the feedback loop. And then let's do our feedback loop output. We'll put that here. Okay, so now check this out. I've kind of just recreated the same thing as having that feedback at 1. Now, in a moment, I'll add a attenuator or something here that lets us control that amplitude. So what's the point of doing that if that feedback already exists inside of this sound object? Well, now what's neat is I can do those processes. I can do filtering, I can do saturation, I can do all sorts of things as the sound goes through the loop. One quick thing that I want to point out before we dig in, check this out. You'll notice in the feedback loop output, it has this delay built in here. So, I could technically change this delay to be built into this. But the point of this is when you do digital feedback, you need to have at least a 1 sample delay. And the reason for this, without getting too into the nitty-gritty of DSP, is if you tried to check what every sample was supposed to be, every digital sample was supposed to be as you played it, this would recursively go forever, right? It would keep trying to check back and see what's happening. So it needs to delay that feedback, at least that 1 sample. Let's call this one beep. Quickly switch the order. So again, this beep that we have is just to trigger our feedback loop, and hopefully once we get it started, we won't need it. So let's do this. Now, once something goes in here, gets delayed, fed back into the feedback loop, let's ring modulate it. Ring. And this is just a multiplication, right? When we multiply 2 waveforms together, it's ring modulation. Okay. Whoops, pardon me. My beep's on top there. Feedback loop output, this is great. We don't want all this though. Let's go B, oscillator, Mink, place that. Okay, so here, since it's just for ring modulation, it's always had the envelope of 1, and then we'll keep this log frequency in here as is. So now we're gonna have a control for that ring modulation. Play. Let's get rid of the embedding. We'll make this nice once we've got more of what we want here. Gate. So this is neat. Because now each time it goes through that loop, each time it gets delayed, it comes back and it gets ring modulated. Now just quickly, when you ring modulate, you erase the carrier frequency, so the original frequency, and you split it into two sidebands. Let's speed that up. Now that's real nice. Now, I'm not sure about this. This is one thing that's been very different when I've been experimenting with this in pure data. I think Kyma has something going on that it's preventing aliasing. So if you keep creating these sidebands, eventually they get to be out of the audible range. Well, more importantly, not out of the audible range, but outside of the Nyquist frequency of what we're doing. I don't want to get too bogged down in the technical, but it doesn't seem to fold over in the same way that it does in pure data. So it's just worth thinking about. Okay, that's kind of neat. It kind of dies away though. And so I want a way to increase this amplitude. So what I can do, I found I had good results with this saturator as gain. So check this out. Let's throw this friend in here. And so now after the ring modulation, I have this gain. So let's give it a run. Here's my gain. I do think initially the range of this is like 50. That's way too much. Let's make it 5. Bank. And let's give that a shot. So this is, with a gain of 1, it shouldn't do anything different. But now, and what's nice about this saturator as gain is that it's got soft clipping built into it, right? So it's not going to digitally clip. It has a bit of rounding off of that waveform. Now we're getting into some interesting territory, huh? I mean, already I think we've successfully created something that's dynamic over time. Whether or not self-regulating, hard to say. I'm going to stop that for a second. So let's think about this in terms of our continuum of complexity. We've actually got two things that are adding to the complexity, right? We've got this ring modulation, then we've got a saturator. Now, saturators don't always add harmonics. In the case of a sine wave, they do. And so, you know, we do have this thing that gets to something that's kind of murky, kind of fast, but we seem to be able to maintain it so that it doesn't devolve into just white noise that isn't changing over time. Let's give it another hit. Oops, I already Command K'd it. Let me play it again. Here we've kind of gotten some noise that's not as interesting. Give it something else to chew on. Of course, by slowing down the delay, we're slowing down the rate at which this evolves through the feedback loop, right? So I might just be buying myself a little bit more time by cranking up that delay rather than claiming that I've set up a system that's interesting. Okay, so if everything I'm doing here is currently adding to the spectrum, let me see if I can balance that out. What I'm going to do here, I'm probably going to fast motion the video and then talk through it, but I'll add 3 band pass filters, so sort of a simple filter bank here. Command B, band pass. Okay, so what I've done here, notice that the band pass filter is actually 2 filters. It's a low pass and a high pass. So each of those prototypes that I dragged from the prototype strip came with these 2 objects. What I've done in these 2 objects is I removed level and sort of replaced it with 1. So this was 0.5 times level. And so assuming level was 1, I just did 0.5 there. So this was level, I replaced that with 1. You'll notice I've made the frequencies independent. So this on the top is frequency 1, frequency 2, frequency 3, here too, frequency 1, frequency 2, frequency 3. But what I've also done is I've left the Q and resonance. Q is the bandwidth, so how wide this filter is, and resonance is the amount of boost around that. And so I've left those as single variables. I haven't renamed those 1, 2, and 3, in other words. So I'll have one control that lets me control the resonance of all 3 of these at the same time, but I'll be able to set their frequency bands separately. I might actually even do this just to give me better control. I'm going to set these to be frequency note number, and I'm going to have to set their ranges manually. Here, it's going to be converted to hertz for me, but it just lets me have my slider be note numbers, which is going to be more musically useful to me than doing this as frequencies. Let's play this. Again, these frequencies, I've set these to be note numbers, and so now they're a mess. Let's go in here and we'll set their range, and there is a better way to set range than this, but let's do it this way for now. I have a lot of old school chops going on here. Okay. Now, see, that's not going to be very interesting because we've got all of our frequencies here set to the same place. Let's give this a bit of resonance. Whoops, let's just go in there. Let's turn that down a hair. Go in my gain. Okay, this is all cool, but let me crack open something that I made a little bit in advance. I'll show you something else that's neat. Okay, so here's something I made when I was practicing, and you'll see this is essentially the same thing. I did things in a slightly different order. Actually, I kind of like the order that I did things in this patch a little bit better. This is our beep oscillator to get things started. Here, things go through the 3 filters. Here's our ring modulation that happens after the filters. I believe in the last patch I was filtering after the ring modulation. And then I have the saturator here right before it goes to the output. This is nice. This probably prevents clipping in our final output. So this is probably a smarter way to do it. I hate to say it, but I don't feel like re-recording that. But the reason I'm pulling this up, oh, and check it out, the delay's also at the end here too. But the reason I'm pulling this up is I have, in this one, mapped all of my sliders to my nano control. And so rather than jumping my mouse around, I can now use these sliders to control things in real time and control multiple parameters at once, etc., etc. So let's get this going. you get the idea. Pretty great, I think, at least. One last thing that I wanted to show here. Here's a feedback loop with the Reverb mono, so the Eugenio Reverb. One quick note here, I found it very useful, and if you're experimenting with different objects, this is going to be important. I found it very useful to put in a high-pass filter that just gets rid of sub-audio. Now, I know technically sub-audio is under 20 hertz, but putting in just a filter here around 40 hertz prevents it from blowing up, you know, really getting caught up in its feedback loop. So here's my Reverb feedback loop. You get the general idea. Okay, so maybe you're thinking, oh, I don't do noise music, I just do beat-based music. How can I use this? Let's throw in a chopper. I have no idea how this is going to work. Well, let's see how we do. And of course, we want this at like 360 BPM. Oh, not 1360 more. So notice the chopper's not in the loop, right? It's after the loop. Now we have a dynamic, noisy texture that we can use as our IDM hi-hat or something like that. Anyway, so what? Well, what's interesting to me about these feedback loops is me giving up a little bit of my control here. I tell you what, I pretty much know what's going to happen when I put a sawtooth wave through a filter at this point in my life. It still sounds awesome, don't get me wrong. It's one of the greatest sounds. A sawtooth wave through a low-pass filter with some resonance is an amazing sound, so I'm not putting it down. But arguably what I'm doing here is more cybernetic. I'm having a conversation with the computer program in this case. I'm not completely sure what it's going to do, but I have ideas about what the variables I'm controlling do, and I'm trying to nudge this system to do the things that I want it to when I want it to. Once again, you can do this in Eurorack, you can do this in Pure Data, you can do this with a no-input mixer and pedals, but have some conversations with machines and see what you come up with. That's all I got for today. Catch you next time.